For a lot of you out there, you have trade deadlines quickly approaching in your league. So there are players that need to be bought, players that need to be sold before then to help you gear up for the fantasy playoffs. So today I have a list of 4 wide receivers, 2 of which to buy, 2 of which to sell before your trade deadline. So first on the list is my favorite wide receiver to buy right now. And if you watched Justin's 5 moves to make video from yesterday, he also highlighted this guy, which is Bucs wide receiver Chris Godwin. And in case you were unaware, Godwin is currently second among all wide receivers in total targets since week 4, more than Cooper Kupp, more than Justin Jefferson, Stephon Diggs, just more than every wide receiver not named Tyreek Hill. He has seen double-digit targets in 5 of the last 6 games, including the last 4 in a row. And his only issue right now for fantasy has been touchdowns because he has none. He's got a big 0 on the year in the touchdown department because the Bucs team is just not great this year. But despite the team being not great, like I said, being 4-5, they're still in the playoff hunt because that's just how bad their division is. So they're still competing, and they will continue trying to compete the rest of the way out, which is going to be good for Chris Godwin. And then you take a look at the Bucs schedule for the fantasy playoffs. They're at home against the Bengals, at Arizona, and then home again against the Carolina Panthers. That is a juicy set of games for this Bucs offense to finish strong, and Godwin is going to be a big part of that. He has the talent, he has the opportunity, and the massive volume right now in terms of targets, plus a soft schedule, and that all is a recipe for greener pastures ahead for fantasy. All he needs is just a few touchdowns to end the year, and you're looking at a high-end wide receiver 2, if not wide receiver 1, to close out the season. The next player that you should be buying right now is actually your choice of either Seattle Seahawks wide receiver DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett, because they're both inside the top 15 at the position currently, with Lockett actually being inside the top 10. Now, obviously, the Seahawks team has just completely overproduced our preseason expectations, and they're actually at the point where they're kind of playoff contenders. I mean, they're 6-3, they're 2 games ahead in their division as the 3 seed in the NFC, and we know that both Lockett and Metcalf are great receivers, but I think there's still the stink of our preseason expectations hanging over them, and that's in addition to us still not believing in Geno Smith, Metcalf's recent injury, and Lockett just always being undervalued and like 30 years old right now. These are 2 top 15 fantasy receivers who aren't being priced that way in trades right now that I think would actually be pretty easy to go out and buy. Plus, when you look at their playoff schedule of Carolina, San Fran, Kansas City, and then the Jets in championship week, with 3 of those games at home, it's a similar recipe to Chris Godwin's with known talent, plus opportunity, plus soft schedule, plus a discounted trade price equals massive wide receiver buy right now. If you have like a Christian Kirk, Garrett Wilson, Deebo Samuel, try to move those guys off of good weeks or even name value for either Seattle Seahawks wide receiver or even Chris Godwin. I would even venture to guess that you could flip Rondale Moore or still Michael Pittman right now for Tyler Lockett, maybe even Godwin, and that's just how undervalued these guys are. So go out and try to acquire any one of those 3 wide receivers for the fantasy playoffs. The first player I think you should sell before your trade deadlines and before the fantasy playoffs is actually Juju Smith-Schuster, or perhaps more broadly, I could really just say any Chiefs wide receiver is on the trade block. We know this Chiefs team is really good. Patrick Mahomes, obviously, really, really good. But we're over halfway through the season, and I still don't feel confident in playing anyone on the Chiefs besides Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce. Every week, it seems like the game plan is just get someone else involved, and there's really no consistency to it. With that said, Juju has been a top 10 wide receiver in 3 straight games right now, with 2 games over 100 yards plus a score, and the other this past week with 10 catches for nearly 90 receiving yards. He's been great recently, and as the conductor of the Juju train all offseason, I could not be happier for Juju, but I want to sell him. The Chiefs have the worst playoff schedule for wide receivers in the entire league right now, with every opponent currently sitting inside the top 7 against wide receivers. Their last 4 games are against Denver and the lockdown corner Pat Surtain, Houston, which is really just because you can run for 300 yards on them, you don't need to pass, Seattle, who we just talked about as being really good, and a big part of that is because of their defense, and then Denver again, championship week. To make matters worse, basically all of those teams are in the top half of most points allowed to the tight end position, so they all just might be Travis Kelce games, not Juju or any other wide receiver game. If you have Juju, I want to be using his production from the last 3 weeks as a sell high point and go buy somebody like DK Metcalf or Chris Godwin instead, players that I trust in my wide receiver 1 spot with much better schedules than Juju in the fantasy playoffs. Same goes for everybody else. If you can sell Hardman, MVS, or the upside of Kadarius Toney, pivot off of those guys for comparable players or some depth players at the running back position, I would absolutely do that and try to do that now before the deadline and before the fantasy playoffs. And the last player that I want to sell before the deadline, another player that I've already mentioned in this video, is Christian Kirk. And Kirk's season so far has basically been a tale of two halves, with the first half being really great and the second half being not so great. Now, granted, he did have a really strong wide receiver 5 finish this past week, but it was in a very predictable, fantastic matchup against the Raiders, who have been terrible against receivers this year. Fast forward to the fantasy playoffs, though, Kirk has to face Dallas, who has shut down basically everybody so far this season, not named Cooper Kupp. Then he gets in New York against the Jets, where he might get sauced on, and then in Houston, which to date has been the worst performance of his season so far, with 1 catch for 11 yards against them earlier this year. Not to mention, Houston is terrible against the run, so that's likely a Travis Etienne game. So if you have Etienne in championship week, congratulations on probably winning a championship. I just don't trust Trevor Lawrence. I don't trust Christian Kirk because he's not an NFL wide receiver 1. And if you're playing Dynasty, Kirk is a sell there too, because they just traded for Calvin Ridley to come back next year. They still might add someone in the draft. I don't want to be caught holding the bag on Kirk in Dynasty, and in redraft, I think you're going to be disappointed in some wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4 weeks in the most important time of the year. So take advantage of his wide receiver 5 finish this past week and move him now before it's too late. And if you haven't watched it yet, you can check out this same video, but for running backs to buy and sell before your trade deadline and fantasy playoffs. You can watch that right up here.